So the serendipity here is that she was hiring. The serendipity between was that this person who doesn't travel much showed up at your parents' house. That is a big part of it, an information-rich environment. You had that in your head. So you had Mandarin, your parents, the person showing up, the person needing a Mandarin-speaking woman. Those are a lot of serendipities right there.
Let's go.
The first time he experienced what he calls a meaningful coincidence, he was just 9 years old. And he and his puppy got separated from one another. They got lost. And hours later, they stumbled upon one another again. Little did he know then that that experience would become a building block for a full-blown passion he developed later in his life to use his expertise in psychiatry to study meaningful coincidences along with serendipity and synchronicity. On this episode of This Magic Life, we are going to learn more about the science behind synchronicities and serendipity with my distinguished guest, Dr. Howard Beitman. Dr. Beitman is a graduate of Yale Medical School, and he did his psychiatric residency at Stanford University. He served as chair of psychiatry at the University of Missouri Columbia Medical School for 17 years. He is the co-author of the award-winning book, Learning Psychotherapy. He hosts the Connecting with Coincidence podcast, and he is also the author of Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. Dr. Beitman, welcome to This Magic Life.
It's magical to be with you, Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful way to begin. So before we dive into your story, your research, your book, I would love it if you could give our audience a solid definition of synchronicity and then of serendipity, because I think a lot of people use those terms interchangeably.
Yes, they do. They are separate, but there is an overlap, not only in the way people use them, but also in how we can think and maybe define them. And let's start with serendipity, since that's one of your favorite ideas among these. Running into my dog was a happy accident, and serendipities are often known as happy accidents. That stuff happens and we don't know how, but they're happy. The result turns out to be positive. Serendipity has been described as where luck, but it could be where opportunity meets preparation. And I will add action. There are a lot of times when you have to act. I wouldn't have found my dog if I hadn't been running around out there. And so you have to see opportunities and then grab them. And sometimes they just fade away. So luck, opportunity meets preparation, that your opportunity shows up and you're prepared to seize it, and then you seize that opportunity. That's serendipity. It often involves things like ideas that you might need. Money shows up sometimes just when you need it. People show up. Hey, maybe this guy's going to offer you a job in China when you want to go to China, for example. It just happens that person shows up when your need is there, a happy accident. So you have to be ready to seize them, as I've mentioned, and will continue to mention. They happen a lot. My research shows that the synchronicity and serendipity are common events. Now, what about synchronicity? Synchronicity is a term coined by Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist, who's written a great deal about the human psyche and the collective unconscious. But one of his major contributions is a small volume called Synchronicity. And he was afraid to publish it because he would be ridiculed, and he was, for writing about what seemed like such a woo-woo topic. Synchronicity comes from two words, sync and chron. Together is sync, and chron is time. So synchronicity is falling together in time. So two things happen around the same time that become useful and meaningful to the person experiencing them. For example, you sit down in an airplane and you start talking to the person next to you, and that person turns out to be ready for a romantic and more relationship, and so are you. And so things keep evolving, and you end up living together and getting married, which is just what happened to me when I finished my residency in psychiatry at Stanford. I was in a plane coming back, and there was this woman, and we started talking, and now we have two children. And those are not uncommon experiences where you meet somebody who also wants to meet you, that what you're looking for is also looking for you. Important to keep that in mind. There are more opportunities out there than you may realize until you think about what we're talking about here. Perhaps the most common synchronicity that most people say they have experienced is you think of someone and they contact you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what is the distinction between serendipity and synchronicity?
Well, they come from different sources, and that's always the case. Serendipity came from an English person from the House of Lords who was really good at finding things when he needed them. And these were more about things. This was Horace Walpole. And Jung was a psychiatrist very much interested in not only psychological interpersonal, but also spiritual. So synchronicity became something that was more about the spiritual, interpersonal, and psychological, where for Horace Walpole and the people who followed him, serendipity became getting information or a thing that you need. And serendipity is very much studied by information technologists, like people who look at how libraries work, and they want to know how people stumble across ideas that they want, and they do research about how the library and the person match with what they each of them have.
So, I guess, irrespective of how the terms were originated, in practice, just for regular people like me, is it okay to use them as synonyms?
Well, thank you for having me be the arbiter of what's proper to say. Uh, and it's proper to use either one of them in just regular everyday life because it's not the name that's important. They come from different places, but it's the experience that's most important. And that experience is you coming together with something that you need right now, or will realize later that you needed and had grasped it. But you now, coincidence, need, surprise, expectation, blah, 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 strange, something weird, but it's useful to you, becomes meaningful to you. It doesn't matter the term, it's the matter of recognizing it. It's a matter of being able to utilize it in your own life.
Beautiful. So,
Thank you.
I know you have had many of these experiences over the course of your life, beginning at least when you were 9, could have happened when you were even younger. And you had one, I know for a fact, because you and I have spoken, and it begins with what you could describe as a low point in your life. You didn't get tenure at the University of Washington in Seattle's Department of Psychiatry, and you were going to say goodbye to somebody. What happened next?
Yeah, I was going to say goodbye to a colleague of mine, and we were pretty friendly, but had a little competition because we were doing about the same kind of work by consulting psychiatrically in medical outpatient clinics. But I want to say goodbye to him. I'm probably never going to see him again. So I'm walking around on the 16th floor at the University of Washington. I knock on his door. His name is Wayne Caton. And Wayne was there. I mean, that's one of the things that about knocking on a door. He might not have been there. So, but that the serendipity started with his being there when I felt like knocking, and being able to follow your own intuition and feeling to do stuff when you're in transition is a big help in increasing the likelihood of coincidences. In other words, when you're in some turmoil, that can increase the possibility if you act and follow your urges and intuition. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? Hey, it's Bernie, Wayne. Hey, when I came in to say goodbye to you. So we sit down. I sit down. He's behind his desk. And this is another thing. You got to be looking around. I mean, if you want this stuff to happen, these synchronicities and serendipities, you want it to happen, you got to be alert, because they're not going to happen if you don't see them.
So pay attention.
Pay attention and scan your environment. Pay attention, scan your environment. So I go, whoop, I look down at his desk. And what is that? What's that paper? What's that paper you got there, Wayne? So I turn around and look at it. And he says, oh, it's about chest pain and psychiatric disorders by some guys from England named Bass and Wade. And what Bass and Wade found was that people who had no obvious coronary artery disease had an increased number of psychiatric problems, especially anxiety disorders. So I said, well, that's pretty interesting. I'm going to the University of Washington. I'm going to the University of Missouri from the University of Washington now. Could I take the protocol you have developed to look at chest pain and panic disorder in primary care clinics where he was working? And I had been working in a primary care clinic in internal medicine. So he gave me the protocol, 1 page, an interview and some questionnaires, just 1 page. So I said, okay, thanks, Wayne. And I think I got a copy of the paper. And I went over to the University of Missouri. And as one guy said, I hit the ground running. Now, the reason I got let's say, fired from the University of Washington, because that's what happened, is that I didn't have enough database papers. So this protocol of Wayne's, a protocol is a list of steps to be able to do the research, yielded a lot of data. It resulted in at least 40 papers with my name on them, and my becoming internationally known in this small area of the relationship between chest pain and panic disorder. Just think about it for a minute. You have some chest pain, and you start getting scared, and you get a panic because you've got this chest pain. And so you go to the cardiologist or you go to the emergency room and they say, you ain't got no problem. And the fact is that if you're 40 years old and a woman and you have chest pain in an outpatient clinic or younger or an emergency room, you probably have panic disorder and not a cardiac disease. So we did a lot of research around that idea. And all that research got me to be able to have enough papers. So I became chairman of psychiatry at the University of Missouri for 17 years.
Incredible. So how did you go from studying panic disorders as it relates to cardiac disease and into studying synchronicities and serendipities and coincidences? Because it isn't just like a side fascination. This is an area that you have done deep research into. You've written 3 books. Your 3rd book is going to be published. You're writing a 4th book. How did this begin and what hooked you?
What hooked me was, hey, this is happening a lot. I mean, I just kept seeing them. For example, in that cardiology thing, when I went to the University of Missouri and I had this protocol, how am I going to get cardiology patients? I mean, I'm a psychiatrist. Well, the cardiology clinic back door opened up onto the front door of the psychiatric clinic. So the patients could walk into us. And that was a temporary phenomenon. We got a bigger clinic after that when I became chair. So that was serendipity to walk into that. So I began to I had been expecting that sort of thing to happen because it happened on the football field, the baseball field. It happened in other academic places. It happened with people. It was just happened a lot. I just noticed them a lot. And was there something special about me? I don't know. I just noticed them a lot. And part of it is I was observant and curious and tried to see what was going on around me, but I would just take note of things. So this was like, okay, this is what happens. Now I've been chairman. I got this. I got some money. I'm finishing being a chairman. What do I want to study? Hey, I want to study these coincidence things. So I could pay for some research assistance as I was my last few years as chairman, and I got a bunch of papers published in psychiatric annals on the subject, and that that was a serendipity too. If you don't mind, I'll tell you.
In what way? Of course,
I'll tell you
please.
that one. It was another one of those windows of opportunity where Psychiatric Annals was like paid for by a drug company, but they published a lot of mostly CME things, continuing medical education things. But somehow there was an editor, a managing editor of the journal, which meant that that I got assigned to edit a journal, a whole issue, and they let me edit the whole issue on the research I developed using our meaningful coincidence scale. They allowed me to publish it in this journal that went out to free to all the psychiatrists in the country. And that was amazing because it wasn't exactly the way things work. And then 2011, I convinced another editor to let me do it again. And that was the last time they let anything like this come through. So again, a window of opportunity to publish papers that were on the edge, and I couldn't have done it after 2011.
So, Doctor, what is a meaningful coincidence?
Serendipity and synchronicity are meaningful coincidences. As we talked about, the basic premise is two incidents come together in a meaningful way to the person observing them. Meaningful is really important, meaningful to you. How are they meaningful to you becomes the next question. And they're usually unexpected and surprising. And the key thing about a coincidence, even the general definition, is there could be a cause, but we don't know what it is. Once there's a cause, then it's no longer a coincidence because it's just something that happened.
Well, let me offer an example from my own
Please
life
do.
because I'm curious what category this one would fall into. So I had graduated from college. My plan A went sideways. My plan B went sideways. I had no idea what I was going to do. And it was August. And a friend of my parents who lived in China, who didn't travel frequently at all, happened to be in the US at this time. He had just come from New York to Maryland, where I was living. And he said, "Oh, Andrea doesn't have a job." He knew that I had studied Mandarin Chinese as an undergrad. And he said, "I just met this woman in New York named Virginia Kamsky, and she only hires young women who speak Mandarin, and she's hiring." And even though I wasn't interested in going into business, that was her company, I decided, because my parents nudged me, to go interview for the job, and I got it. And it was as a result of taking the job and going to China when I was 21 years old that I met all of these journalists who were outside of my company and decided that, yes, in fact, I wanted to be a journalist. And I quit after 6 months and came back. But how would you describe the, I think, serendipitous showing up of my parents' friend and him telling me about this job? Because this was back in the day before the internet, before cell phones, before any of the stuff that we have now.
It still happens without all that stuff too, and that's what you have to pay attention to. That's the first thing. What you had is not a serendipity, but a series of serendipities. You had a series of them. You didn't have a job, and I can't emphasize how much importance there is that when you're in that in-between phase, as you were wondering what am I going to do with myself, especially if you're younger. and like college, graduated. It's like, what am I going to do with my life? I don't know. That's when you don't want to constrict yourself. That's when you want to open yourself up to opportunities. And some people are able to do that. So then you show up at your parents' house, and the serendipity has to do with your parents and your parents' contact with people. They know a lot of people. Your parents know a lot of people. That's important because serendipities are more likely in a rich, information filled environment. And just your parents had created around themselves a rich, information filled environment with people who were very interesting and had a broad range of interests themselves. So then that was one. Your parents created an environment, a rich environment. Second, and you didn't know what to do with yourself. Those are key parts of this. So then somebody who doesn't travel very much shows up just when you need something. And remember, what you're seeking is also seeking you. So this person was a connector to somebody who was seeking a Mandarin speaking American who could then be hired.
American woman.
Well,
American woman. She only hired young women who spoke Mandarin.
Excuse me, young women. And that's important because it was a restricted range that you fit. So the serendipity here is that she was hiring. The serendipity between was that this person who doesn't travel much showed up at your parents' house. And then the additional serendipity was she was hiring, and you went and you took it because you didn't have anything else to do, among other things. And it sounded like fun, go to China. So, and you'd studied Mandarin for some crazy reason. You'd study Mandarin. We didn't talk about that, but that is a big part of it, an information-rich environment. You had that in your head. So you can, if you want, tell us why you studied Mandarin, but you did. So you had Mandarin, your parents, the person showing up, the person needing a Mandarin-speaking woman. Those are a lot of serendipities right there. And then you go to China. And oh, look, I'm around a bunch of journalists. I don't want to be a journalist. Well, but it looks like fun. Looks like something I want to
Exactly.
do. So I think I'll go join CNN for 14 years or something.
Well, I wish I could have started at CNN, but I didn't. I started at a member station of National Public Radio, where I was earning $10,600 a year, working in Columbia, South Carolina. So I believe me, I went from South Carolina to DC to another radio station to Baltimore to Miami before the second try CNN hired me. I tried twice.
What you just said is so very important, Andrea, that you were willing to play in the bush leagues, as we might call it. You play in the minor leagues before you got to where you wanted to go. You were willing to do that. And I can't emphasize that more. You were willing to do that. So please go on with what you else were saying, but that's all part of how serendipity works. You still have to work. You still have to sacrifice.
So the reason that I studied Chinese rather than Japanese or Russian, which were other languages that were offered at Middlebury College at the time, was that I had lived in Hong Kong as a child, and they speak Cantonese there predominantly. Now they speak Mandarin more since China took Hong Kong back. But at the time, they spoke Cantonese, but it was a very familiar culture for me. And my parents recommended that I study Mandarin because they said Russian is the language of the 20th century. Chinese will be the language of the 21st century. And at the time, Dr. Beitman, I thought I was going to become an American diplomat. When I graduated, I also studied political science and Asian studies. And then I took the Foreign Service exam my senior year and I failed it. Didn't plan on that. Little bit of a curveball. And, that changed the course of my life. But I will tell you that 13 years after I graduated from Middlebury, I was promoted to become CNN State Department correspondent, which meant that I was the main reporter at CNN covering American foreign policy. So I didn't become a diplomat, but I was a journalist who reported on the diplomats and on American diplomacy. So that's the beauty of how you cannot predict how your career journey, let alone your life, is going to unfold.
Now, when you described that, you had an image of your future. And somehow, in a way that is not exactly the way you anticipated it, but pretty close, you became the observer of the diplomats. So you became immersed in diplomatic culture. What do
Mhm.
you think about the relationship between your imagining an outcome as a diplomat and what you ended up having?
That's an interesting question. I didn't appreciate what the life would have been like. And I remember someone telling me, trying to make me feel better, that I wasn't accepted into the Foreign Service because I failed the test. And they said, you know what, Andrea? It's a really hard life. You have to move from country to country every like 3 to 4 years. But I will tell you, that's exactly what I did as a journalist, even working in local news. And then when I went to work for CNN, I was moving every 2 to 4 years to another country, to another city, to another state. But what I wanted as a journalist, what I was thinking as an aspiring diplomat, was that my life would be an adventure, that I would learn, that I would get to have a front seat, even a back row seat to what different cultures are like, what different people are like. I wanted my mind to expand and grow. And that was absolutely the life that I experienced as a journalist. For sure. It's why this is my second podcast, because I get the opportunity to learn and grow and share this with my audience because of incredible guests like you. I have a question to ask you. In your research, Dr. Beitman,
I love that
have
story,
you
Andrea. I love that
found,
story. Anyway, sorry.
thank you, thank you. Have you found any similar characteristics or traits among those people, maybe who frequently experience synchronicities or serendipities or meaningful coincidences?
Well, you illustrate a lot of it. You you're a vagabond at heart. You like new stimulation. You're curious, and that's the curiosity is so important. But it's before the curiosity is your willingness to look. They come together. You wanted to see things. Why? Because you got this need to have your mind stimulated. It is fundamentally important to you to want to know more stuff and have your curiosity stimulated with yet more information, and yet more experiences. Why? Because you say you want to grow. You say you want to grow. You want to become more than you have been. Now, that impulse to expand yourself is fundamental to what I'm suggesting is the value of synchronicity and serendipity. It helps, these events help you grow, become more and more yourself, and more a self that you might like to be.
I'm also wondering, Dr. Beitman, and again, just in thinking of my own life experience, because I've also had some spectacular fails, not just failing the Foreign Service exam, but when I was 43, after I'd been at CNN for 14 years, there was a new president who had come on board, and I wasn't his cup of tea, and he didn't renew my contract. Another way of putting it, I got fired. And it wasn't the way I wanted to leave, to say the very least. And I was forced to reinvent myself. And that's a whole nother journey. But I'm curious if the mindset of somebody who falls down maybe many times in their life and picks themselves up, dusts themselves off,
And
and
starts all
keeps
over
moving
again.
forward is important. How important is
It's
that?
vital. It's vital. It's absolutely vital. By that I mean turn stumbling blocks into stepping stones, as some people say. The only failure from failure is the failure to learn from failure. Sometimes they're pretty awful experiences, but trying to be able to learn from failure, however you describe it, the forces that create these things can be brutal. It can be very hurtful, but it's dust yourself off and start all over again is the best advice I can give anyone interested in this serendipity and synchronicity. That sometimes if you don't get to where you're going, that's good. Sometimes when you don't get into the relationship or it doesn't go further that you wanted, that's going to turn out to be a good thing. Sometimes these failures actually turn out to be good things, and you've got to look for the silver lining. You got to look for the outcome that works, and it's usually there.
I love that because in hindsight, I can say now that I got to know what it was like to be a diplomat, because when I lived overseas for CNN covering Japan and China, I got to know a lot of American diplomats and diplomats from other countries. And I realized, you know what? I don't think I would have liked having to toe the party line, having to bite my tongue when I disagreed with American policy and keep a straight face, keep a poker face, and go out and repeat what American policy was. So it was a much better fit for me to be a journalist who got to like triangulate, connect the dots and speak. What I tried to do was speak truth to power and put out the facts and let the public decide. So it was a much better fit. And then when it came to being fired from CNN, I had actually been unhappy there before I had been fired for at least 2 to 3 years because I had become a mother. My son was 3.5 when I was fired, and I never saw him. But I didn't have the courage to quit because I was afraid. I was afraid there was nothing else I could do. So when I was fired, I was forced to reinvent myself. So I share those stories as a way to maybe alleviate some of the fears that our audience may be feeling about their uncertain future, or the fact that they didn't get their dream job, or they didn't get accepted into their dream school, or whatever they think their dream is. You are going to have so many more dreams that could turn out to be even better, even brighter, even more exciting than what you had imagined.
Yes, yes, and yes. What you think you want for yourself may not be the best thing for you, even though you think it is.
Dr. Beitman, how can our audience become more attuned, if that's the right word, to noticing, let alone attracting synchronicities in their daily life?
Andrea, attuned is the right word. Much more than I think you even realize when you're saying it. And we could talk about that another time because I've got research about sound and synchronicity that suggests attunement is fundamental to being able to see them. For those of our audience and you who understand music or energy or dance, which is where I know it, is that dance we do 5 rhythms conscious dance thing where you do whatever you want. You move around and you just get used to the music and it gets faster and faster. And after a while, we become entrained with each other, meaning that we're vibrating with each other. And that vibration makes it for a group dance, even if we're not obviously looking at each other, dancing with each other. And that kind of attunement can happen with your environment too. So when you're in a good resonating place with yourself, when you're feeling okay with yourself and alert and curious and looking around, what you're seeking may be just around the corner for you if you keep your eyes open and let it hit you. So openness is another key, looking around, curiosity, openness, and being in situations that are environmentally rich with possibilities. That really helps. But their resonance influences the way you vibrate. And so you influence them and you go back and forth with them. So it definitely influences. Just look, I mean, just it's fun to look at people and their dogs and see how the dogs end up being something like the person. I mean, it's
Yes.
like my son and his dog, and they're the same. They're the same guy, except Walter runs the show more than my son does. But that's another thing. And that people with their spouses, they begin resonating with each other. They become more and more similar. So there's a lot to matching or your frequency with the frequency of other people.
Doctor, I haven't asked you to comment on the name of the show because I chose to call this show This Magic Life rather than This Serendipitous or This Synchronous Life because I felt that serendipity tends to have more of a positive connotation. And I felt that magic captured both the fairy dust aspect, the like, ooh, sitting next to that pretty woman on the plane and then you marry her. Uh, and it also has the black magic aspect, the pandemics, the fact that you get into an accident or lose your job or don't get into the foreign service, which then pushes or pulls you in a direction, in this case, in your career, that you could never have anticipated, but that became something wonderful. That's why I call it This Magic Life. I'm curious what you think of that, if you think I'm just full of baloney.
You are right on with that. There's a good and the bad. This life on Earth. If you believe that we've chosen to be here, why would we choose to be here? Well, one of the variables that's key and fundamental to being here on Earth is the polarities. That with every good, there's some bad coming around. And part of the fun of being here, the challenge, or at least the agony sometimes, is helping stabilize that polarity and bring both of them up so that bad isn't so bad and the good gets better. So that's an important place to start. And a lot of people want to think of both synchronicity and serendipity as always positive, and they are not in the moment. There can be negative. And the trick that you keep emphasizing, and I hope you keep doing that, is that you have to turn these stumbling blocks into stepping stones. You have to find a way to see the positive in them. So that when you say the two parts of magic, you're talking about this reality having polar opposites in them that we have to resolve by experiencing them both. I think that implication is good, but I'd like to know, Andrea Koppel, what do you mean by magic?
I mean the serendipity, the synchronicities of life, the fact that you cannot explain it. You can't explain it with like something that, let's say, an engineer who says, well, you put this with this and this happens. Like, what are the chances that my parents' Chinese friend, who didn't travel very much, would happen to be in Maryland at my house at the time that I didn't know what I wanted to do? And he had just happened to meet a woman who only hired young women who spoke Mandarin, and she had a job open. So you can't explain it logically. You can't explain it in a way that I think would make sense to maybe a hard scientist. You have to just believe that this exists. And I think it's more real, this kind of magic, Dr. Beitman, much more real than pulling a rabbit out of a hat or a sleight of hand card trick. This is real magic.
And so a book by Dean Radin is called Real Magic, and it has a lot to do with telepathy and clairvoyance and how those things happen.
Okay, well, we're going to have to provide a link to that in show notes, and you can bet I'll be ordering it as soon as our interview is done. Dr. Beitman, I have two final questions to ask you. These are questions I try to ask all my guests. The first one is, what can our audience do right now to become more magical, to experience more serendipity, more synchronicity in their lives?
Expecting the unexpected, because these things are unexpected, to be scanning your environment, to be curious about weird stuff that happens, to be willing to think that some of this might be useful to you, these things that happen, to recognize when there are greater possibilities. Information rich environments is a term for that, where the possibilities are there, like walking through an airport and seeing someone that you admired and wanted to work for, never met, and going over to that person. That's being alert. Instead of having your head down, you have your head up. So those are key ideas to increasing meaningful coincidences.
Beautiful. Looking back on your career thus far, what do you think has been the secret to the magic that you've attracted and experienced in your life?
Well, the trouble with that is it's not trouble. I like to have a good time. I like to have fun, and this is like these things are like fun. They're like being on a playground, and like weird stuff happens on the playground. People come. Sometimes like being at a dog park and kind of just running around and see what happens. So there's a fun aspect, but fun as it is for you, Andrea, involves learning new stuff. So fun isn't just like hanging around and laughing and stuff. It's fun is that includes it, but it's learning as you're doing it. So play becomes something that is fun because it's learning and it's experiencing something that's exciting, that's new, that feels right, that points in new directions. That's fun. And in order to do that, you have to get disciplined. You have to be the kind of things we talked about earlier in your own mind and keep learning and keep being able to adjust to adversity. Playing sports and trying to get good at football and baseball is a great way of doing it. Whatever other sports you're in, because you mess up playing those sports. So what are you going to go home and say, I messed up and run it over? No, you learn from the mistakes you made and try to do it better the next time. And fundamental to me is in all this is just trying to get better all the time. Keep on getting better all the time. The Beatles and Sgt. Pepper have a song that says, getting better all the time. Continue to try to get better, which is elevate, I think, your frequency, refine your frequency, increase your ability to contribute to the world around you, be of service, not of servitude, but of service, so that you can help others and things come back to you when you help other people. It's a privilege to love, to be able to know that you can love as well as be able to receive love. It's not just all about you receiving it. And to continue to try to help humanity in this time of crisis, of global warming, of war and conflict, and major, major greed. If we can confront these problems from a different perspective than what we've been doing, is thinking about how an elevated consciousness that serendipity and synchronicity brings us can aid the world to become yet better for all of us.
What a beautiful note on which to end. Dr. Beitman is the host of the podcast Connecting with coincidence. He is also the person who has organized the Coincidence Project. We'll include a link in show notes, and he's the author of 2 books, including Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen. Dr. Beitman, I want to wish you many, many more serendipitous and magical moments to come.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's been a pleasure again being with you.
Let's go.
Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of This Magic Life. Our mission is to inspire you to stop fearing your future and start getting excited about all the serendipitous and magical opportunities that await you. Make sure to subscribe to This Magic Life on YouTube so you don't miss any new episodes. And for on-the-go listening, give us a follow wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. We absolutely love to get feedback from the This Magic Life community, so make sure to drop us a comment on YouTube or a 5-star review on Apple. And you can always find me on LinkedIn at Andrea Koppel, aka the Career Magic Maker. I can't wait to see you soon.